Hello and welcome to another episode of the 21st Century Work-Life Podcast, where we talk about how the world of work and our attitudes to work are changing. My name is Pilar Orti, and I'm delighted to say I have a friend on the podcast. Another person who regularly throughout the years has hopped onto the show behind the microphone, and we have talked about a lot of different things. So, as is customary recently on the show, I'm going to let my guests say their names themselves. Say hello to the listeners.
Hello, listeners. This is Theresa Hollema. And Pilar, I am glad to be here again with you.
Yes, it is really, really nice. And of course, you might know, I was going to say, as you probably know, but it depends how long you've been in this virtual team space and listening to the show. But Theresa is the author of Virtual Teams Across Cultures, Create Successful Teams Around the World, which is, I have to say, it's an excellent book about how to navigate the global nature of some virtual teams, taking the virtual aspect into account, as well as the cultural.
Thank you, Pilar. I appreciate that.
Good. So, but what we're here to do today, listeners, is this is our, I was going to say our monthly recommendations show, but now it might be, we skipped a month. I'm not sure where we're going with the schedule. I've gone to an episode every other week instead of weekly. But this is one of those episodes where a guest and I, in this case, Theresa, we talk about a topic that we have been discussing either online or offline or in our heads. And then we have recommendations for you. We've got a number of articles, books, audio listening, even a newsletter this month that you can sign up to. So we'll talk a little bit about a topic that we've been riffing about, and then we'll go on to our recommendations. Hello, listeners. This is future Pilar coming here to say I always forget at the beginning of these episodes to point you to the text version of the newsletter, which has all the recommendations that Theresa and I are going to be talking about in the second half of this episode. So if you want to sign up to the monthly newsletter, go over to virtualnotdistant.com/newsletter. Okay, let's get back to the conversation. But before we start, Theresa, what are you up to at the moment? What are you doing in this world of virtual teams?
Hey, well, yeah, there's a lot going on, so it's always interesting. Right now, because you mentioned my book, Virtual Teams Across Cultures, so I've been supporting global teams and global leaders to figure out what all that means. And I've always held this question: how do people develop cultural competence while staying in their own country? Because we're traveling less and we're moving less, we're relocating less. How do people do that? And what I'm finding is just there's more and more research that shows that it is possible, that we can act one way locally, where we see, smell, taste, and touch things. But then when we click, we can behave in a different way. For instance, use a different communication style and things like that. I mean, I could talk for hours about this, but what was fun is that one of your listeners told me a fantastic story about how she supported someone in another country to be more effective in a global meeting. And it was just such a great story. So there's great examples, and it is possible. And so that's what I'm very busy with right now, trying to understand what that means.
And do you think, I mean, this is a purely hypothetical question, but hearing you speak, do you think then, so for me, okay, I'm not going to put a question. I'm going to tell you a reflection. Tell me what you think. It sounds then like if we're working on a global team that is a virtual global team, instead of one where we're all co-located but have moved from different countries or have been brought up in different countries, it sounds to me like if we're working in a global team, but still living, breathing, and surrounded by our own culture, our own geographical culture. One, is it more difficult? And two, do we even know that we have to behave differently when we're in our global team? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Exactly. Both of those points are true. So the first is, yes, it is more difficult because if you can imagine, just like you said, if you relocate to an international team all in the same location, all of your senses are used to make sense of what's going on and how to behave. You're looking at other people, role modeling behavior. So you get some input and you can see and use all of your senses. Let's say you're staying in your own country, you're on a global team, and you need to communicate differently in that global team where all you see are the emails or all you see are the video meetings. So you need to somehow figure that out. And one great way that I've noticed is through feedback from others. If they're generous enough to say, hey, I'm noticing this, but you need to behave differently. And then, so with practice and with feedback from others, it's not easy. We need to give each other some space to make mistakes and to figure this out. But it is possible, and it is more challenging.
That is really interesting. And what I'd like is then at some point, you can come back and tell us more about what you found out. Because so how are you researching this?
Well, fortunately, there's more academic research because I love robust academic research where they've really spoken to people and had personal interviews and did some studies. So that's one source. Fortunately, there's more of that. But then I'm also asking people about their own personal stories. What made it work? How did they learn? What was the aha moment? How did they figure it out? How did they make mistakes? And what was the ultimate impact of changing their behavior? So this is a topic, when I have more, I'll come back on and we can really dive into it.
Yes, excellent. And meanwhile, what we're going to talk about today is, it's not directly related, but it's also about connection between people, what we're going to talk about, and different kinds of connections and being very mindful and deliberate about how we're connecting. So, of course, we know in this podcast, we love all these kind of things. But you were looking at some point, actually a few months ago when we started to talk about this, you were looking at this difference for teams in organizations, the difference between bonding as individuals in a team and bridging those connections across teams. Can you just remind me a bit how you were looking at that? Why did you start looking at that?
Yes, absolutely, Pilar. And it was great that you and I could, explore this topic together. So I came across an article by Michael Arena where he was talking about bonding and bridging, which are both types of social capital. And social capital is, let's say, the value that our relationships bring towards our careers or to our work or whatever that may be. And there's other types of social capital as well. For instance, vertical capital, how much the relationships going up and down the hierarchy add value. But in this case, Michael Arena wrote an article about bonding and bridging. And bonding are the connections and relationships that we have within the team. And bridging are the relationships and connections we have with other teams, so outside the team that bridge with other teams. And what he showed in his article, he was looking at a team, it was an engineering company of 700 people, and he noticed, or he was able to research before the pandemic and then also observe 1 year later after the pandemic. And what he noticed was that the bonding was still okay. Yes, it had gone down a little bit, but within the team, they still had strong connections that were worthwhile and still valuable. However, the bridging across different teams had dropped dramatically. And I found that article and that research so fascinating because that's what I had noticed anecdotally when I was working with virtual teams during the pandemic.
Yeah, same here. That was the feeling as well, and also it was vocalized. It's funny because at the beginning, when people started to jump on video calls, when I remember working with one group of managers where actually some of them said they were more connected to other managers in the organization, but eventually, I think, and gradually, that stopped. And there was this feeling that, yeah, I know how to work with my team now. What I'm missing now is where does the rest of the organization fit in?
Exactly. So I think managers and teams were just hyperactive and hypersensitive about, how can we connect? How can we make sure we're achieving our goals? And so they put a lot of attention towards strengthening the team, so bonding. But it was these informal, where you used to run into people at the coffee machine. How do we connect with other teams? It tends to be a bit ad hoc. And those had slipped away during the pandemic and did not get the attention. But quite a few people were pointing out that they missed it. And they recognized the impact of not having those relationships. So for instance, if you want to implement a big change project, you need those connections outside of your team. Also, those bridging connections are a great source of innovation, of new ideas, of different ways of doing things. If you're a marketing team, inviting finance sometimes to just help you brainstorm on a project gives you a different perspective.
Yeah.
And then they also noticed that if you want to have a career development, it's good to have bridging with people outside of your team. And so all of these bridgings were weakened a little bit or quite a bit, during the pandemic. And I think that's also where we need to put some attention even now as we're working hybrid.
That's also what I'm hearing, even though I'm more sensing, I'm sensing across a computer now what's going on and what everything is. And, the articles and what people are talking about, and that sense that if, and to be honest, that if we want to continue this bridging, what do we call it, activities, connection, if we want to continue bridging across teams, we need to be in the office.
Well, I'm not quite sure.
Well, that's what I'm hearing.
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree with you. Yeah, people are calling it culture.
Yeah.
Right? The culture, we need to get people back in for the culture. If we identify what it really is bridging outside of the team. And if we're intentionally putting activities in place that help people to bridge outside the team, then in fact, we don't have to all rush into the office like people are saying.
I want to pick up on, you mentioned that it's being referred to as culture. It's a very, I think that's very insightful, because what I'm thinking is that, one, the word culture sometimes is just being used to say social activities. So that, but even when we are really thinking about the whole company and how things are the same across teams, that's the culture, then I think it would really help to define the bridging bit. Because bridging is very different to creating a culture of, a culture of innovation or a culture of honesty, whatever culture you want trying to create. But actually the bridging of it also requires a slightly different strategy. So if we're thinking culture, and what we're meaning sometimes is actually that we want teams not to work in silos, and we want them to connect. We want them to be aware of what they're doing. It's very important to identify that as bridging, not just as culture. We have to be specific, really specific.
I agree with you. So I'm recognizing what you're saying as well. I don't know if organizations are. They could experiment by being more intentional about helping people to bridge, because bridging used to happen very ad hoc in the organizations. And so if that ad hoc is not happening anymore, can it be replaced by more intentional, organized? I think the answer is yes. So then there's an opportunity there to have bridging really happen and perhaps maintain or at least thrive or nourish the culture that people want.
This is where I'm going to extend the invitation also to other listeners to let us know if they have any examples of bridging, either in their organizations or examples they've come across. Because something, and I might refer back to you, Theresa, when we started talking about this, and we're like, okay, let's look into this. And I found it really, really difficult to find any kind of, for a start, you could talk more about academic research, but just any examples that were really looking at this. And I thought, ooh, okay. Was that the same experience for you, or have you got a little bit further with digging into that?
I don't want to use the word disappointing, but I can use the word disappointing. That a lack of, let's call it academic research or articles that focused on this. So I started doing interviews with clients and other people and trying to see, well, what do you do? Just the request that you put out to your listeners, which please, listeners, if you do have some ideas, we're absolutely welcome to them. I asked other people as well. And so, for instance, let me share with you a couple that I collected. Joining ERGs, so employee resource groups, which are specialized groups that gather people together who usually have like a common identity. You can say, like, for instance, women or LGBTQ+, people of color, etc. So those are groups that are organization-wide, cross functions, cross business units as well, and help people to get to know each other a little bit as well. Volunteer for short-term projects. So especially those that are outside of the team. When you do go to the office, be intentional not to actually sit with your team. Because like we said, if the bonding is going well, if the team is going well, when you're in the office, work on those relationships outside of the team. People that you don't know or that you rarely run into virtually, look for them when you're in the office.
Let me, because we've got three good ones there, and I just want to come back on a couple of things. So really interesting, the word you use for what I used to call communities of practice or special interest groups. And now they were something else, which of course someone needs to be doing, and probably on something like, what's it called now? Is it still Microsoft Viva or whatever? When it used to be Yammer, Facebook has removed Workplace. So, hey, that's another infrastructure that we've removed. I think this is still, like, for years we've been saying, hey, people, you need to use the digital space to connect your people as well. And this has to come from either from the organization or from the organization making it easy for anyone to create some of that.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to point anyone who's interested in that, any listeners, to a past episode with Rachel Happy, which I think it was a couple of years ago, which was called The Challenges of Building Digital Communities in Organizations. And it really is about this. And Rachel has been in this area for like 20 years. So she was talking about how difficult it is to help organizations understand the potential of this and how autonomous they need to be in a way. Now, the second one you said, which is about, and tell me if you want me to come to this a bit later, if you weren't done with that, is you mentioned about if we're in a hybrid setup, or if we're in an office optional approach, to use that time in the office intentionally when we're there and try to talk to people in other teams, which is really interesting because this is not the rhetoric you hear. Sometimes you hear, well, we want to be in the team together because I want to be with my teammates when I go to the office. You shared with me a really interesting piece of research around the hybrid workspace, which we will link to in the show notes, called Where is Your Office Today? New Insights on Employee Behavior and Social Networks. And one of the things they're saying here is, of course, everyone's trying to sometimes use the office so that one team comes in one day, another team comes in another day. And this is not great for bridging then. So this is another complexity.
Silos is not what we need in organizations, and particularly if we're concerned about the culture. But that's the point, I think, here, is that the bonding, the teams are doing quite well. Anecdotally and from research, we see that teams are doing well. It's the bridging that's suffering. So it seems to me when you come into the office, then get out of your team and start seeking out people who are from other parts of the organization.
I have to say, I don't envy the people who are who have reduced the real estate and have smaller offices because they planned, okay, if we get 3 teams in this day and 3 teams in another day. And now suddenly it's like, oh no, teams, they want to be together for some things, but also they also want to be with everyone else. So it's like, it's more complicated than it seems, this hybrid thing as well.
Hybrid is very complicated. Let's not underestimate that. But I think as well, for instance, where you sit. You come in, and if you have planned seating or open seating, something like that, sit somewhere else. And if the organization can help to facilitate that, that could also help the bridging within the company.
Yeah, and I think that once we've realized that actually the office space is going to also be complicated to do some of this bridging in, if we, as we're talking, the digital space, it is so underused. The digital space for the whole organization it has so little attention paid to it, but...
Agreed. Pilar, I would just want to emphasize and agree with you. So, for instance, using it as a means to cross, because it's very easy to join someone else's meeting, or it's very easy to meet for a coffee with somebody you don't know very well, or someone in another department. Click, 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 and you can make that work.
Yeah.
And also sharing doesn't have to be all synchronous. Sharing and connecting asynchronous in channels and groups where you have shared interests. These help you to meet people outside of your own team.
And I think we underestimate how much this needs to be role modeled, maybe by it doesn't always have to be the more senior people in the hierarchy. It can just be the more visible people who sometimes are not the most senior. And examples and just a reminder of this and this encouragement. I think hopefully we are at a point where I think I've been saying this for a while now, but hopefully we're at a point where organizations start to realize that this is the next stage of making something that's not completely co-located work.
You and I have just been focusing a lot on bridging, but I do want to share one piece of research that I found. And this was for a global team that were implementing an ERP package, so a software package for the entire organization. And it was global, so people were sitting in different locations. And what they found was if a team is not well bonded. So if a team does not have strong bonding social capital, the bridging actually doesn't work so well. So you could be great bridging outside of the team all the time, but the information needs a place to land. It needs a fertile soil within the team. And I found that fascinating, but also makes sense. So keep that bonding going. Keep making sure that the team itself is connected and relationship oriented and able to do things together and knows each other's strengths. And then you have a place where the bridging information can land.
That's super interesting that you've got to continue that bonding in order to do good bridging.
Yes, exactly.
A couple of things, and then we'll move on to the recommendations. But this thing of focusing inside and outside of the team, I remember reading some research by Sandy Pentland, I think it was in 2012 or something, where it looked at the communication patterns of high-performance teams. And they did this in the co-located space. And basically, they were measuring how people were talking to each other and who they were talking to, not really the content. And what they found was that when teams were having lots of internal conversations, they were not having the external ones. And so that they couldn't do both at the same time, but that high performance teams had a mixture of both. There was that. So nice. I think that it's a really nice, I'll put the link, well, I don't know if we put Sandy Pentland. I think it was communication in high performance teams or something. It blew my mind, the fact that you could measure like team bonding, basically.
Yeah. I remember that. And they had measurement necklaces that they wore around. Yes. It was really quite cool. Yes, but you're reminding me that when we're talking about bridging and bonding and bridging to other teams, we have to be very careful that not all the bridging is on one person, because then you burn them out. So something about intentional and also equal bridging, perhaps, thinking about what you said.
I used to make it one of the parts of visible teamwork. So when we talk about visible, I think it was maybe deliberate communication or visible work, I don't remember. There is a part about bringing the information back from the outside the team into the team in a way that is useful, in a way that is shared. And of course, I think it's very important. I used to say mainly this was more maybe the responsibility of the manager, because by the nature of the work, they might be in touch with more parts of the organization. But I think that now that is not as relevant. I think that everyone has to be making that effort, because different people at different levels in a team even will tap into different parts of the organization.
Absolutely. Nice.
Great. Is there anything else that you want to say before we move on to the recommendations? We've covered a bit. I'm quite happy.
No, I'm good. I think it's a fascinating topic, particularly as we're going forward in the hybrid structure. So, and of course, I always consider it from the global team perspective as well. Mm-hmm. And I think this bridging happens locally. It's just my guess. But I think when you have a bonding in a global team, that's crucial. And I think the bridging is happening where people are located. So I think that's also quite interesting, which combines perhaps the global with the hybrid local. Yeah.
I like that, and making more use of that and seeing it as a strength.
Right.
I'm sure you.
Exactly. So where
I've said this many times.
Exactly. So where people are located is crucial, and giving them the space to connect with people locally, but also find out what's going on. Bringing it to the team, and that strengthens the team, but also leads to creativity. So I could talk about that now for hours, but the global team, I think, really benefits from this bridging and bonding concept.
Well, listeners, we're going to move on to the recommendations part of the episode. But if you are done and you want to leave, I want to make sure that you connect with Theresa, who on LinkedIn is Theresa Hollema, but we'll put the links in the show notes. Her website, where you still have lots of resources, don't you, in virtualacrosscultures.com. And if you do follow Theresa on LinkedIn, Theresa does these wonderful carousels where she looks at bits of research and she explains little bits of research that she's come across, and she explains it in like 5 slides with like, I don't know, 10 words on each slide, which is fantastic.
Thanks. It's what I like to do, I must confess. I'm a bit of a research nerd, so.
It's great. Someone's got to do it. The rest of us can make things up as we go along. And also, listeners, I will, in case you've joined us recently, I will put the link in the show notes to some of our other conversations. And Theresa, you are the only person who who has an episode interviewing me on our feed that we did for Cavo.
Yes.
And that is on the feed as well.
Funny how the roles were reversed. Nice.
Yes. So that was really nice. Okay, well, listeners, Pilar at virtualnotdistant.com. If you have anything to say about this, we'd love to hear from you, or you can use the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. But let's move on to the recommendations. It's nice putting this together because I think we have some recommendations that are linked to the topic of bridging. So that's nice. And then, listeners, we have some which are a little bit about remote work, about the world of work. And then we have some on the edge as well. Because we're not just professionals, we're human beings. So, right. Shall I start, Theresa? I think I'll kick off with one that I wanted to recommend. And then I was like, did Theresa share this on LinkedIn? I think you did. Which, so if I give the title, and then you can just tell us a little bit about what caught your eye on this one. And the title is The Critical Minutes After a Virtual Meeting That Can Build Up or Tear Down Teams. And this is via the HBS Working Knowledge. What was this one about, just in a nutshell?
I thought this was a fantastic research. So one thing I liked about it was that it's in the wild. It's not at a university where they're paying students to do it. This was a 7-month research where they observed a global team. So part of the team was in the US and part of the team was in China. So they had people every day watching them and observing meetings and communications, etc. So it was really intense. One of the things that they found a lot of things, but one of the things they found was that after a virtual meeting, the experience of the people, so the post-meeting and what they call backstage, could make a difference in the success of the team. So if you finish the meeting, you click off the virtual meeting and you start complaining, then that's one approach. Or the other approach is that you start thinking about how to resolve some issues or reflect on the meeting, how to improve it. And those two very different experiences led towards different outcomes with the success of the team. It's a great article, great research.
Wow. Listeners, go and read it. So the critical minutes after a virtual meeting that can build up or tear down teams. I've got the flip side. So this is about meetings, and I've got something around asynchronous communication, but I liked it because it's not just about how we do asynchronous communication or why it's important, but it goes a little bit deeper, and it's called The Secret to an In-Sync Startup. Ditch your meetings and try an asynchronous culture. And this is the founder of a startup who shares the 3 pillars that he emphasizes for an async company. So he talks about no micromanagement, documenting everything, and then treating hiring as a segmentation exercise, by which he means segmentation like product segmentation, as in just being very niche in who you are attracting. That's where the segmentation comes in. And I like it because it has lots of examples about what async looks in their startup, but it's not about that. But it is about things like how it helps to avoid micromanagement. And it talks a lot about documentation. Listeners, I direct you to it. I don't know if you've read it or not, this one. Have you come across this article?
No, I haven't, but it sounds fascinating, so I'll take a look.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one. And that was in Review First Round. What else have you got?
I would like to recommend a series of articles on LinkedIn by Thomas Hansel of the Complexity Partners. And specifically, he is writing about giving feedback, the complexity of giving feedback, and he's looking at a new way of doing this. Now, I became interested in Thomas Hansel and the Complexity Partners a couple of years ago when I was writing my book, because giving feedback is hard, it's challenging, but it's crucial. And so how do we give feedback from a distance? And basically, the complexity partners are saying, wait a minute, we need to go in there as if we really just don't know, because from this distance and across cultures, we really don't know. Anyway, there's a whole series, and I highly recommend it, giving a new view or new attitude towards giving feedback.
And this is on LinkedIn?
Yes.
Okay, so it's we'll put the link in the show notes, but Thomas Hansil, Hancil of Complexity Partners. I haven't checked it out yet, but I will.
Well, I must say I haven't checked it all out either, because right now there's only 3 of the 6 articles, so who knows what's coming. But anyway, I like their approach.
Yeah, nice. Very good. And also it completely links to what you were talking right at the beginning of the episode about this.
Exactly. Yes.
Competence, cultural competence.
Exactly. How do we know what's going on over there? Yeah.
I wanted to recommend an article that comes from another newsletter that I am subscribed to. The newsletter is by NetNigma, and it's actually Caterina Bolle Carbonell, who's been a guest on the show. And this is called A Simple Pen and Paper Tool for Community Builders and Network Weavers. So totally related to our bridging topic. And basically, she describes how to map out your network in the organization beyond like who you are connected to. Like you start to think about, okay, I talk a lot to this person. Who does that person talk a lot about? And like that, you start to see. And then I think she explains how you can use that. For example, if you, as she says, for community builders, okay, I see these people are really separated in the network. How can I bring them together? And so you can take this as an individual, as an organization. And so I just like that simplicity of dots on paper to map out the network. I mean, there's loads of tools that help do that in organizations, but I think for ourselves, it's a nice solution.
Oh, yeah. It's always fascinating. By the way, I always like Katerina's articles. So I'm glad you recommend
because she's very research
yes, she
based
is.
as well. She's great. She's great. Yes. So again, the name of the article is A Simple Pen and Paper Tool for Community Builders and Network Weavers. And we'll put the link in the show notes. If you got one more.
I do. But this isn't an article. This one's more of a newsletter. And it's called Borderless by Safety Wing. And Safety Wing is an insurance company, focused for remote companies and their global teams. But this newsletter I really like. It's geared towards nomads and people who work remotely. And it has fun surveys, it has some quizzes, but it also gathers articles that would be interesting to people who are working remotely.
So it recommends other articles as well?
Oh, absolutely. It links to other articles. And for instance, the visa requirements in different countries, how to travel with children, things like that. I like it.
Good. Another rabbit hole for all of us. Go down. Great. And so this is Borderless, and Safety Wing is the people behind it. Excellent. Well, we've got plenty to read, but let's go on to the book recommendations. I am going to, and because listeners can't see you in case you blush, but I am going to recommend your book, Theresa Hollema, Virtual Teams Across Cultures, Create Successful Teams Around the World. And if I remember correctly, you took a very similar approach to what you were describing earlier, how you're looking at the cultural competencies, which is loads of research and lots of talking to people. So it's a nice mix of that.
Thank you, Pilar. Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned, I love looking at academic research, and because it's robust and they have real in-depth concepts and they think about things, but then we need to make sense of it regarding how we work every day. And so I love that science practice link, and that's my approach. So and combined with interviews, because that's also quite cool and fun to do, is what are people really doing? And there's some great examples and great stories out there in the world.
It also means that you bring examples to the book that we haven't seen before, because sometimes I find a lot of leadership books, they have, especially the more general leadership, they have the same stories all the time. We hear about the same names. So this is really nice.
True. Thank you. Yeah. You're absolutely right. I tapped into people that most of us don't know. They're not. They're not in the news, so they're just like you and I.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So, what are one of your recommendations?
This is a book I have not read yet, but it has been read and recommended recommended by many people. It's called Invisible Woman, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. And I think as we're going into AI and we're being confronted, or at least made aware of all the biases that can show up in AI, I think we need to already take a step back and look at all the biases that are showed up in the data that we have and how the world is actually more geared towards men. If we think about healthcare research, or for instance, the size of a piano bench, I mean, these are all made towards men as the standard. And so this book looks at that, highly recommended. So I haven't read it yet, but I'm planning to do so.
It's in my Kindle. It's been sitting. Oh, it's one of many. I have to say, my mother read it because I bought it for her as well. And she really liked it. And I think she was reading it when we were both staying on holiday in Denia. And she kept saying, oh, look at this, this story. Oh, did you know that? So that's always a sign of a good book, is that she was constantly, I was like, no, don't tell me about it because I want to read them for fresh.
Fabulous.
So this is a very good recommendation.
But I would also love it for a man to recommend it, particularly somebody who's involved in creation or innovation or production or things like that.
That would be great. So listeners, if you've read it, let us know. So the book is Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Caroline Criado Perez. Right. I went very Perez, very English there. So I've got a completely different book written by a man and a woman. I wonder whether she's helped him write it. And it is completely different. It's called Tools and Weapons, The Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age. And it's by Brad Smith and Carol Ann Brown. And Brad Smith is the Microsoft Vice Chair and President. And he also has a podcast, which I haven't listened to. I am finding it fascinating. Like, if you don't like Microsoft, don't read it. Because, of course, this person is at the heart of Microsoft, and it presents Microsoft as a very good company in very many ways. So if you don't like them, don't read it. But if you are Microsoft agnostic, a bit like me, it's fascinating. It's all about how they are fighting, how they have fought and continue fighting for privacy of the data, like really looking at whether governments should be able to look at them, the fights they've had to do for this. And so I'm thankful, actually. And also with the hacking, very interesting. And I'm just been reading about that. So it took me a while to get into it because it explains how it all works. At the beginning, it was really technical, but then it starts to go into the more meaty stuff, like with the hacking and all that. I recommend it. I'm finding it fascinating.
Sounds real interesting, and particularly the opinions of somebody who's making the change, who has such an influence on the direction that we go in this.
Yes,
fascinating.
Yeah. And I find it very, it's very, I feel it's warm because you really, like we always say, oh, this company does this and that company does that. But here you are hearing, well, we got this phone call in the middle of the night, or we all had to meet up during the weekend to solve this, or it's really the human side. And I think it's a great reminder that companies and the people within companies making these decisions are not good or bad. And that there's a lot going on that goes behind this that a lot of the time we don't know. Why should we? So I think it's a lovely book. Again, it's been sitting in my Kindle for ages and I finally got around to it. So it's Tools and Weapons, The Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age by Brad Smith and Carol Ann Brown. You've got another one, haven't you? Totally different.
Totally different. So I'm in the middle of a book called Post-War, A History of Europe Since 1945 by Tony Jute. And I'm loving it. So it's a very big book. It's a big read. But I was born and raised in the United States, and I came over to Europe about 25 years ago. So you can imagine my history learning, the courses that I took, was all happened from a U.S. point of view. But I've been living in Europe for 25 years. And I've been to the churches and the memorials and the this and the that. I've read the articles, but I haven't really put it all together, you can say. And this book does a beautiful job of that, giving different experiences in different countries. I mean, the author has done a ton of research. And as somebody who looks at cultural diversity, it's also interesting to see how each country experienced the post-war years, but then also all the way up. Right now I'm in the 80s or 70s, 80s. So it just keeps going, and the different experiences, and pretty soon the European experiment is coming together. It's just a great read if you're interested in history and also in relation to the present.
Until what year does it cover? So when did he write it, or when was it published?
I'm not exactly sure which year he wrote it, but it hasn't been that long ago. So somewhere between 5 and 8 years ago, he wrote it. So I haven't finished it yet. I'm not sure where he's going, when he will stop. But right now, I'm really enjoying it.
What happens at the end?
I know. Exactly. That's the big question. It's a cliffhanger.
Yeah, wonderful. So this is Post-War, A History of Europe Since 1945 by Tony Judt. Excellent. Great. Well, that's a lot of reading, I think, between the articles we have and this range of books we have, that there should be something there for everyone. But listeners, if you have another book that you are enjoying that you think our newsletter readers or our listeners would welcome, then email me, Pilar at virtualnotdistant.com. And I forgot to say, which I will probably record for the beginning as well, that of course we have the monthly newsletter, the written version of this, which will have all of this together. And you can sign up to that over at virtualnotdistant.com/newsletter. So, seeing as we have the listeners, these are like the hardcore listeners waiting till the end of the episode all the way with us. We've got some treats, some podcast listening, and we've got a series of different things. So that's really good. Let me start with an episode from a podcast. Again, I think I said this with Maya and Mark, that we used to listen to so many podcasts around remote work, and I do less of that now because I can't think about it anymore. I can't add to my thinking for now. So, but I did come across a show I'd been wanting to listen to for a while, and it's called Remotely Serious with Curtis Duggan. And the episode I wanted to recommend is called James from Freedom Files' Bold Decision, Choosing Latin America over the USA. And it's from the 19th of May, 2024. And it is all about that. It's all about the considerations of the practical aspects of it, but also, of course, what it felt like to move across continents. So I thought that was an interesting one to listen to.
That one sounds very interesting. Yes. Absolutely. Yes. I mean, particularly the culture shock that the writer experienced.
Yes. So that is Remotely Serious. And it's the episode from the 19th of May, 2024. How about you? What have you got for us, Theresa?
So one that I'm a loyal listener is called Hard Fork.
Yes.
It's part of the New York Times podcast, and it's with Kevin Roose and Casey Newton. I don't know anything really about AI, or I'm very low level, but they keep me informed.
Yes.
It's as if I am keeping up to date, and they do it in a very humorous way. They've had amazing guests, for instance, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau,
yes.
But then also the CEO of Google. So they're doing this in a very nice way. But I walk away informed. I'm surprised what I know just by listening to them.
And if anyone listens regularly to this show, they'll know that Mark and I recommended this same one in the last recommendations. But the reason I thought you should recommend it is because you are the one that introduced me to it. And you said, you really like that. And it's like, yes, definitely. They're so funny.
They're so funny. I laugh out loud while I'm walking. Yeah.
It's really interesting that you said about the Prime Minister of Canada, because I've seen him pop up in another show. I can't remember which one.
He's everywhere.
This is part of a PR campaign for, from the conversation that he had on Hard Fork, it seemed like they want to open up their country to more people, to more AI companies.
Yes.
And this is a campaign. I found it very interesting because we've never seen such a high status political figure do their round on podcasts.
Very interesting. So that was the only time I heard him, the Prime Minister, but wow, that makes sense.
Yeah, amazing. So, Hard Fork, we like all the episodes. Really funny. And they're great. Great. I've got another podcast that I've been listening to for a while, and I recommend this regularly on the newsletter, and it's Guy Kawasaki's Remarkable People. Do you know Guy Kawasaki's work?
No, I don't, but I will check it out.
Yeah, so I came across him a long time ago when he wrote a book called Enchanted, which is how to enchant people with your products and stuff. I think he worked for Apple, but we used to be an Apple ambassador, and he's now an ambassador for Canva. I think he's done that. He's a wonderful, I reviewed once his book on my blog, one of his books. I really rate him. And he's lovely to listen to. But this particular episode I really recommend, which is with Charan Ranganath, Unlocking the Power of Memory. And he's a psychologist. He's written a book all about memory. And again, he talks about how memories are formed, why we recall certain things and not others. And it's a lovely conversation. So it's Guy Kawasaki's Remarkable People from the 29th of May, 2024. One more?
I have one more.
Great.
Well, Pilar, I know you love writing. I call you a writer, absolutely, before I call you anything else.
Oh, really? It's good you don't call me stupid or something like that.
Regarding what you like to do. You're a writer. I like writing. And so it's nice to hear writers reading their work. And this one's completely off topic, but The New Yorker has a podcast called The Writer's Voice. And these are between, let's say, 25 minutes and 35 minutes. Is the writer, it's him or herself or themselves, reading their work on the podcast. And it's beautiful to hear.
And is it always fiction? Is it always stories?
Always
short
fiction.
Stories.
Yeah, short stories.
Nice. I think I'm going to listen to that because you won't be surprised by saying I've been wanting to write a short story for a long time, but I don't read them. So I would need to start. So this is a good one. I'll make a note of that.
Well, I know you like doing puzzles, so it's nice to have this in the background while you're doing puzzles.
Oh.
That's when I use it. Yeah.
Oh, great idea. So this is The Writer's Voice by The New Yorker. Well, funnily enough, I've got one last one, which it's relating to writing, but it's also relating to business and remote. And this is an episode from Writer on the Side, which is hosted by Hassan Osman, which has been on this show a couple of times. And Hassan was one of the first people that I came across in the remote space. In fact, he's the reason I met Lisette.
Wow. We still are thanking him then.
Yes, exactly. Lisette found me on his testimonial page for one of his books. And that's how she approached me. And that, the rest was history.
What a nice story. Great.
Yeah. So he came on the show, but then he came again. And actually, I brought Lisette in and we both interviewed him he was talking about Don't Reply All, which is one of his books. And we had like this thing where Lisette and I were saying, no, email's going to die. And he was saying, no, it's not. He was right. So he's recently changed careers, as in he got made redundant from his job as part of a layoff, and he's decided to wait until he looks for another job, and he's decided to run his own company, and he's got a newsletter, he's offering services, but this time instead of around virtual teams, which is what he's been known for, it's around AI. And this is, I saw this on
thinking forward.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he's got a newsletter called AI for Leaders. But this episode in particular is not about AI. It's called No Longer Writing on the Side. And you'll need to look for it on your podcast app because it's not on his website. And it's episode 146 of Writer on the Side. And he explains his whole process of being laid off, how he worked through the experience, and how he started to make a decision of what to do next. And I thought this is a very honest episode. I mean, he's a very honest, open guy, but I thought this could be very useful for those who are struggling with the same, or who are going through, it doesn't have to be a struggle, those who are going through the same thing, or for just anyone in business. Very interesting. So Writer on the Side.
So it's a real human story that we can learn about the experiences of someone else.
Yes,
nice.
Very much, very much so.
Pilar, I have one more recommendation, and actually it's your podcast that you do with Tim Burgess, which is called Management Cafe. I've listened to a few of them. I think it's brilliant. Real great insights and questions and reflective conversations that you both have, and particularly with Tim's experience of having started a company, ran a company, and sold a company, and his reflection, and then your your questions and your insights as well, and the stories that you bring. I think new managers and middle managers would really benefit from having these coffee size or these snippets of ideas as they're developing themselves. So I recommend your podcast.
Wow, look at that. Listeners, it's the first time that one of my shows gets recommended on one of my shows. This is really nice. That's great. Well, I'm glad you enjoy it. It's really nice to hear that you're enjoying it. Thanks, Theresa. I think that's it. Have I left anything out from our Google Doc?
I think that's a great list. Probably too much, but that's, I'm going to go and look at your recommendations and you look at mine.
What a rabbit hole. Well, listeners, thank you very much for getting to the end of this episode. Again, if you want the newsletter version of this, you need to go to virtualnotdistant.com/newsletter. You can connect with me, Pilar Orti, on LinkedIn, but tell me why you're connecting. You can connect with Theresa Hollema over at LinkedIn. You can say hello, you heard her on this show, always good to know. And you can check out Theresa's website over at virtualacrosscultures.com. Theresa, thank you very much for coming here once again.
Pilar, thank you. It's been really a lot of fun.
A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work Life podcast. We know there are many other shows for you to choose from. Remember to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app, and you can check out the full show notes over at virtualnotdistant.com/podcasts. Talking of podcasts, we have another show you can listen to, Management Cafe, which you should also be able to find on all podcast apps. I have been Pilar Orti. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.